Now, some of you may have been watching the Olympic Games that opened this week in Pyeongchang, South Korea. If you're not watching them this week, maybe you have seen them before. And at least, I don't know if this is an official thing, but at least in the media, you always hear someone say at the beginning of the Olympic Games, "Let the games begin." Right? Have you heard that before? Let the games begin, right? That kind of kicks it off. Let the games begin. It's this moment where all the athletes are gathered, everyone's there, it's time to compete. Let the games begin. And there's kind of this let the games begin moment in the Gospels, this moment where that's far more serious than the Olympic Games. It's not just a competition. It's this moment where the destiny of the world hangs in the balance, this let the games begin moment, and that's the Transfiguration. Now, the Transfiguration starts off unassumingly enough. Jesus takes Peter and James and John, they go up on a mountain to pray, and this was not the first time that they would have seen Jesus go up on a mountain to pray. He was in the habit of doing that, we see in the Gospels. He had to get away to be able to pray, and if you have ever spent time in prayer, you will know why he did that. Because you cannot be transparent before God if you have people around you. It's just impossible. You can't really get into the depths of prayer if there's folks trying to talk to you and try and moving around before you. And so Jesus had to be vulnerable before God, had to commune with God. He goes up on the mountain to pray. And this time, he takes Peter and James and John, and they must have been thinking, we're privileged. This is going to be kind of a special teaching moment. It's going to be just us and the rabbi. But then something very surprising happens. These three disciples follow Jesus up the mountain. The gospel tells us that Jesus is transfigured before them. And that word for transfigured is a word in the Gospel of Mark that's related to the word that we use when we talk about tadpoles turning into frogs or caterpillars turning into butterflies. It's related to the word for metamorphosis, this change. Now, for Jesus, it's not being metamorphosized into something different than he is. It is a metamorphosis that shows who he is at his heart, who he truly is. The Transfiguration draws back the curtain on Jesus' identity, and Peter, James, and John see Jesus for who he is. And in case they weren't sure, there's a voice that speaks from the cloud. "This is my Son, whom I love. Listen to him." Jesus is the Son of God, the beloved of God, the one we are to listen to. And then the prophets, Moses and Elijah of old, they stand beside Jesus and they testify to the fact that Jesus is in the line of the prophets of the Old Testament. Jesus is the one that Moses was talking about in Deuteronomy 18 when Moses said, there's going to be this prophet. He's going to be like me, but greater than me. He's going to come, and you're going to need to listen to him. Here he is. Jesus is the one who takes up the mantle of Elijah, whose words are like flame. Listen to him. And then the disciples are in the presence of the glory of God. And they're hearing the voice of God. And they're witnessing who Jesus is. And this whole moment, it's almost dreamlike, right? They want to hang on to it. And the gospel says that Peter approaches Jesus in this moment of splendor. He says, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up some shelters." And I think that's how it is oftentimes when we experience something that kind of makes the hairs on the back of our neck stand up. This moment where we kind of come into the presence of God. If you've ever had that, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's a moment that you want to hang on to, and I think that's what Peter wants to do. He wants to put four walls and a roof around this moment, codify it, freeze it in time. He wants to be able to get back to that moment there on the mountain where, boom, it's the glory of God shining through Jesus right before them. He wants to always be able to come to that. I remember we had a friend in seminary, and part of his story was that at one point he had had this time in church, and people were praying for him, asking for the Holy Spirit to fall upon him, and he had this kind of breakthrough spiritual encounter. And he said, sometimes when I'm not sure what to do, or I'm feeling kind of down, or I'm not sure of my course, I try to get back to that moment. Remember what that was like years ago, that encounter. I think that's what Peter wants to be able to do, to have this moment. Let's build some shelters. Hang on to this. But no shelters are cobbled together. The disciples hear the voice from heaven, and then it's all over. And then Jesus looks like what he always looked like. Then they're going down the mountain into the thick of ministry and mission. And here's the thing. The transfiguration is like a fire. Jesus was transfigured before them, and then this transfiguration spreads. And he begins to transfigure the disciples' very lives. And I think it's like that for us today, because knowing Jesus transfigures our whole lives, even the places of struggle. The transfiguration wasn't this one-off event. It was more of a beginning. Let the games begin. Let the transfiguration begin. See, the Gospels don't end on that mountain. Right? That would have been a pretty good ending, right? Jesus has a successful ministry, goes up the mountain, is transfigured, the end. But that is not where the Gospels end. Jesus' ministry does not end on the top of the mountain. Jesus brings Peter and James and John up that mountain. He prays with them, and then he calls them back down the mountain to teach and heal and cast out demons, to be with people in the very hardest places of their lives. They don't get to stay up on that mountain and just kind of bask in Jesus' glory. Now, true that the transfiguration is a foretaste of things to come. Later in his first letter, the Apostle John will write about, maybe thinking about his experience, and he'll write and he'll say, what we will be has not yet been revealed. What we do know is this: when he, Jesus, when he is revealed, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. The glory of Jesus is a glory that by virtue of our adoption into his life, we will share with him into eternity. And the transfiguration points us to that eternity. The transfiguration reminds us of where we're headed. And I think it gives us hope that even when things are not going well, when we lose our course, when health fails and plans do not come to fruition, that we are people who are looking for a city that is to come. That is our North Star, the transfiguration. We're moving towards something beyond this earth. Now, the transfiguration is bracketed by suffering, and Jesus' prediction of suffering. Right? It's this moment of glory, but before Jesus goes into that moment of glory, there is first the prediction of suffering. He says in Mark 8:31, he says, the Son of Man is going to be handed over to the elders, and he's going to be tortured and killed. 3 days later, he'll rise again. Peter says, no way, that can't happen. And that's when Jesus famously says, get behind me, Satan, right? And then Jesus goes up onto the mountain of glory, but we see that God's glory is refracted through the cross. And Peter, he had to grow into that understanding, because it just didn't make sense to pair glory and suffering. Much later, Augustine, who is a writer and pastor from the 5th century, he writes, Peter, you didn't understand. He said, Peter did not understand what he wanted to remain with Christ on the mountain. It has been reserved for you, Peter, but for after death. For now, Jesus says, go down to toil on earth, to serve on earth, to be scorned and crucified on earth. Life goes down to be killed. Bread goes down to suffer hunger. The way goes down to be exhausted on his journey. The spring goes down to suffer thirst. And you refuse to suffer? And after the transfiguration, again after that moment of glory, Jesus instructs the disciples. He says, don't speak about it till the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. And that means that he must die if he's going to be raised from the dead. And in 9:31-32, he says the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They'll kill him. After 3 days, he'll rise. They did not understand what it meant, and they were afraid to ask about it. And then a third time, in chapter 10, Jesus again predicts his death. He says he will be betrayed to the chief priests, teachers of the law. They'll condemn him to death, hand him over to the Gentiles, mock him, spit on him, flog him, kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. All of that is the setting for the transfiguration, this moment of glory. The transfiguration is deeply tied to the cross. God's glory will be revealed in Jesus' death on the cross. And the disciples quickly learn that they will not be exempt from suffering just because they have witnessed the glory of Jesus on that mountain. They follow Jesus up the mountain, and then they go right back down the mountain directly into a situation of suffering. There's a crowd that's gathered around the disciples that remained, and there's this father. Remember this story? There's this father. His son is oppressed by an evil spirit. He throws the boy down, the spirit does, throws him down. It's taken away his powers of speech. It's a terrible situation. It's a situation of human suffering. And the father brought this boy to the disciples, and they were like, look, can you do something for my son? But the disciples were unable to drive out the demon. And Peter and James and John walk right into that. It's this moment when they are confronted by the great neediness of the world, the great suffering of the world. And this moment where I think they and the rest of the disciples realize that on their own, they don't have what it takes to fix it. And I put myself there in that moment. What a terrifying moment. It's like a bad dream. I mean, there's this crowd, and all eyes are on the disciples, and there's this father pleading for them to help his little son. And back in chapter 6, think about this if you're one of the disciples. Back in chapter 6, he gave the disciples authority over evil spirits. He sent them out. This was not their first time running up against evil spirits who oppress people. They knew their way around a power encounter with the forces of darkness. But it's not working. Nothing happens. They pray, and the boy is still under the power of that spirit. They seem powerless in the face of evil. And that's what Peter and James and John walk into. They go from this amazing encounter with the power and glory of God up on the mountain down into the valley to run smack dab into human suffering, weakness, and uncertainty. Jesus, of course, is able to save the child. And something changes in that moment. Because it's from that moment on, Jesus is walking toward Jerusalem. In fact, in the Gospel of Luke, we read that Jesus sets his face to go to Jerusalem. That's where the whole story hinges. It's like he goes up to the mountain, is revealed in glory, and goes down from the mountain to walk straight toward the cross in Jerusalem. And part of what I think the Transfiguration, bracketed by human suffering and Jesus' prediction of his own death, part of what I think it teaches us is that knowing Jesus transfigures our whole lives, even the places of suffering. On the one hand, I think we need these places to meet Jesus. Right? We need these mountaintops. The Transfiguration said that Jesus took them up Mount Tabor. We need our Mount Tabors, right? These spaces where we can step back, put down the phone, unplug from the screen, tune out the news and the politicians and the talking heads, and get refocused on God. Sit like Mary at the feet of Jesus. We need places where we can join Jesus on the mountain doing that prayer work that holds everything else together. And this is part of why Jesus' teaching on prayer, when he taught on prayer, he said that when we pray, we're to go into a room, lock the door, go into that prayer closet where it's just you and God. And so we need that space. We need to hike up Mount Tabor regularly. I think that's part of what this story teaches us. But encountering Jesus and becoming his disciples is not about finding inner peace up on the mountain. It's also about coming down the mountain with Jesus and launching into the messiness of human life and being with people right where they're at. This transfiguration continues. It's extended into time and place. It's spread down the mountain. And all that we are and all that we do becomes transfigured as we walk with Jesus and become his disciples. Let the transfiguration begin. You see, the transfiguration doesn't remain on that mountain. It comes down to places of hardship, suffering, places of difficulty. And I think when we know Jesus, it transfigures our whole lives. Our minds are transfigured, our imaginations are transfigured, our bodies are transfigured. Can you say that with me? Can you say transfigured? Transfigured. We're transfigured with him when we follow him. And what I mean is that knowing Jesus reshapes how we see the world. It transfigures how we see the world. Knowing Jesus changes how we see ourselves, how we see others. So much about how we live our lives depends on how we see things. Do we see the glory of God shining through creation? Do we believe the words of the seraphim and the prophet Isaiah that they sing, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. Whole earth is full of his glory"? Or Psalm 19 that says, "The heavens declare the glory of God and the skies proclaim the work of God's hands." Do we believe that? Do we see snatches of God's glory littered throughout our lives, even in the places of suffering? Do we see God in other people? Or do we just notice their failures and heartbreaks? Do we just come to them as basket cases worthy of a pity party? You know, after Peter was up there on that mountain with Jesus, when Peter reflected on having witnessed the Transfiguration, his life was changed. And we know this because Peter talks about his experience in his own words in his second letter. So 2 Peter, he says, "We heard the voice when we were up on that holy mountain." He says that because of that experience, the prophetic message of the gospel was confirmed for him. And part of what I think Peter was saying is that the encounter on the mountaintop enabled him to be able to believe God, to believe more deeply, and to be able to trust more fully. I think part of what Peter was saying is that that mountaintop changed him, and so he urges the church to pay attention to the gospel. He says, think of it as a lamp shining in a dark place. It's about paying attention. The disciples went up on that mountain with Jesus. It was just him and them. They really saw him. They're completely focused on Jesus. After that voice and the appearance of Moses and Elijah from beyond the grave, the Gospels say that they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. After it's all said and done, it's all about Jesus. He's the center. He's the one they see. And that focus on Jesus changes things, transfigures their lives. It transfigures our lives. When Jesus is at the center, we start to see life and others and ourselves differently. You know, I think oftentimes we're not aware of how having Jesus at the center of our lives changes things until we spend time with folks who have not experienced that change. You know what I mean? So, folks that have a toxic outlook, who only see what's wrong, who are critical of everything. Why me? You know, sometimes we also run into people, and I've had the chance to spend time with folks like this who are committed to Jesus, who have had this living encounter with his love, who, you know, sometimes they're in their last days, who know their lives are coming to an end, and they have this peace that passes understanding. Why not me? And I think it's having Jesus at the center like that, paying attention to him, that makes all the difference. This is my son whom I love. Listen to him. And our lives get transfigured bit by bit until all of it comes to shine through in some way with God's presence and glory. You know, having our lives shine with God's presence and glory sounds grand until we remember that the glory of God is reflected through the cross. And to truly draw close to Jesus is to draw close to him in his suffering. May I never boast of anything, said the Apostle Paul, except the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. And yet somehow when we have Jesus at the center, when we pay attention to him, our lives really are transfigured, often in ways that we can't anticipate. Christian writer Kate Bowler, author of the new book, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Loved, describes how people will send her these letters. And Bowler is dying. She has incurable cancer, and people write to her, and they try to counsel her about what she should think and what she should believe about God. And most of the letters that she receives are the typical things that we hear when someone's gravely ill. Doesn't amount to much. But in her book, she also writes about a letter that one man sent her in which he describes how he and his family, and I wonder if this was in another country, he and his family were held hostage by a gunman and that somehow in this situation, the ropes that the guy had tied them up with, somehow they were made slack and somehow they escaped. And he says, look, he writes a letter to her, look, I don't know how that works. I have no idea how this works, but I wish this for you as you move forward. He says, I know God was in there somewhere because this tremendous sense of peace came over me. I have no idea how this works, but I wish this for you as you move forward. Here's the thing. Jesus' transfiguring power gets turned loose in our lives, and most of the time, we won't know what it all means. We'll say with the writer of this letter, I have no idea how this works. It will be beyond us, just as it was beyond the disciples. We'll know it's true, but we won't understand it. Sometimes things will be fixed. Jesus will show up. The situation will be transfigured. The wounds in body, mind, or soul will be healed. It's fixed. There it is. And I've had those experiences, and I bet you have too. And sometimes Jesus will show up in situations in our lives, and things will just make this right angle turn, this 180-degree spin, and be transfigured in a way that maybe isn't what we had hoped for, but that is somehow true and real, that somehow makes all the difference. I have no idea how this works, but I wish this for you. And sometimes, even when things do work out, it's a third option. Sometimes Jesus will transfigure a situation in just the way we had hoped for, and we'll realize that there's more going on. We'll realize that getting what we asked for changes everything, and that maybe the way Jesus gives it to us has transformed us in our expectations. Think of Peter. Think of what happened back in the early days when Peter was just getting to know Jesus. They were out on that boat, and they were fishing all night with nothing to show for it. And Jesus approaches them and says, hey, look, cast your nets onto the other side of the boat into the deep water. They don't believe him at first, but they do it out of respect for him. And they catch so many fish that the nets start to break. The boat starts to be swamped. They have to ask for help to bring in all the fish. And there's Peter standing before Jesus with just what he wanted, a catch of fish. And he has the strangest reaction. He falls down on his knees and he says, get away from me, for I am a sinful man. And Jesus tells him, hey, Peter, follow me and I will make you fish for people. This moment is transfigured for Peter. He realizes it was never about the fish. And when Jesus is there, he comes in and he leads Peter into this moment where he's invited to follow him, and that's what Peter does. You know, the disciples saw with their own eyes the glory of God in the face of Christ. That's what Paul calls it in another place. And you would have thought that seeing the glory of God revealed in Jesus would have answered all their questions. It would have been this eureka moment. Now I get it. Man, Job asked to see God. Job said, look, all of my suffering is worth it now that I've seen God. And they would think that the disciples would say, I've seen Jesus. I've seen his glory. I get it. It's all okay now. But no. Peter, the chief apostle, kind of starts babbling this stuff about making little shelters for everyone, get some walls around this event, box God in some way that we can understand and will be safe and sure. But the gospel writers tell us that Peter did not know what to say. Peter didn't know. And so Peter spouts off this nonsense when he comes face to face with the glory of God. And I don't know about you, but I often long for God to give me certainty, to give me clarity. Look, God, just make it clear. I want to build some little shelters, understand Jesus, put him in a box, a nice box, but put him in a box. Limit that uncertainty. Give me something to hang on to. I'm a little like Peter in that way. I want shelters of certainty, but the transfiguration does not lead to certainty. However, the Transfiguration can lead to trust. Transfiguration reminds us that the future is guaranteed in God, and God is good. The Transfiguration takes us up the mountain with Jesus and then takes us right back down into the valley, walking behind the Rabbi of Rabbis. And I think this is one of those things that we've got to be willing to learn if we're going to grow as disciples of Jesus, as people of faith. We've got to start moving beyond those places where we feel like we need control, where we need a guaranteed outcome. There's some word that everything's going to be all right. We've got to be willing to let Jesus transfigure situations and people. We've got to be willing to let Jesus transfigure us. I mean, that's really at the heart of it. Following Jesus is first and foremost about entering into a process of transformation. All of us are being transformed, writes Paul in 2 Corinthians 3:18. He says we're being transformed from one image into the image of Christ, from one degree of glory to another, for this comes from the Lord, the Spirit. This transformation is at the heart of discipleship. It's what it's all about. It's what growing up into the image of Christ means. It's what the disciples get a peek of that on the mountain. It's what drew them back down into the thick of things. Let the transfiguration begin.